Saludos desde la Vanguardia, bienvenidos a esta 23ª conferencia de sostenibilidad que hoy va a versar sobre la ansiedad climática. En muchas conferencias como estos encuentros ha salido tangencialmente la implicación, el efecto psicológico que está teniendo el cambio climático en nuestra sociedad. Pero hoy queremos abordar este tema y convertirlo en el centro de la conversación en la sesión de hoy de forma amplia, junto con la psicóloga ambiental Whitmarsh, que es del Centro para el Cambio Climático y la Transformación Social de la Universidad de Bajo. Whitmarsh es profesora de psicología en la Universidad de Bajo y directora del Instituto de Sostenibilidad y Cambio Climático. Fue nombrada miembro de la Orden del Imperio Británico hace 3 años, en 2022, por sus servicios a la investigación social en cambio climático, energía y transporte. Ha investigado los distintos estilos de vida bajos en carbono para el Consejo Europeo de Investigación y forman parte también del equipo asesor del Grupo Parlamentario para un nuevo Pacto Verde. Sin más, vamos a saludar. Gracias por compartir este rato con nosotros, con la Vanguardia.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be with you.
Bueno, pues como siempre, el formato de estos encuentros es que primero escucharemos una presentación de nuestra invitada y a partir de esa presentación estableceremos una conversación con ella durante unos buenos minutos, unos 50 minutos aproximadamente. Cuando quiera, Lorraine Whitmarsh.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm really happy to be talking about the work that we're doing in our centre, which is CAST, the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. The context for our work is that tackling climate change will require nothing less than societal transformation. This is what we need to reach net zero emissions by the middle of the century, according to the International Panel on Climate Change. And we know that technological change will be a big part of reaching those emissions, but by itself it won't be enough. We also need very significant amounts of behaviour change. Just looking at the behaviour change required by consumers, that accounts for about 1/3 of the emission reductions needed, but the rest of the reductions will come from changes within businesses, within communities, and within government. So that also requires behaviour change within those settings. At the moment, while countries have made emission reductions, most of that has come from changing the energy supply side, so moving away from fossil fuels towards more renewable energy sources. Where we've made much less progress has been on how we use energy and resources, the demand side. And we've seen demand growing over the last few years, which means that we have a lot of work to do to actually change those patterns of demand. And that's really where behaviour change comes in. If we think about how much behaviour change we're going to need, it's very significant, particularly in higher income countries. So this figure here comes from some work by the Hot or Cool Institute, and they have calculated the average carbon footprint in lots of different countries. And you can see them here. So the United States is at the top. They have an average carbon footprint of about 18 tonnes of carbon dioxide per person. As you go down, you see Australia, Canada, and so on. And the UK and European countries are not far behind North America. And so Spain, for example, has a carbon footprint of somewhere between about 5 and 6 tonnes of CO2 per person. Now, if we want to stay within our 1.5 degree limit, which is a safe, globally agreed limit of carbon emissions, we need to be aiming for 1.1 tonnes of CO2 per person. So that, in the case of Spain, for example, is a reduction of 6 tonnes to 1.1 tonnes, which is 82% in the next 10 years. So really big changes that need to happen, particularly in higher income countries. And of course, there's a lot of differences between countries, but also within countries, we see lots of differences. So not everybody has the same size carbon footprint, and people on the highest incomes tend to have much bigger carbon footprints than people on the lower end of the income spectrum. So the wealthiest 10% have a carbon footprint more than 4 times that of people at the lower end of the income spectrum. In the US, that difference is even bigger. It's 16 times more. So we need to recognize that people need to change their behavior to different extents, and that their abilities to change are also different. When we look at which sorts of behaviors need to change, these are the sorts of things which, at least in European countries, are the main changes that we need to make. So, for example, if we were to live car-free, we would save about 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person. So that would get us some way towards our goals. Shifting towards electric vehicles would also make a big difference, reducing the amount of flying we do, renovating and refurbishing our homes to make them more energy efficient, adopting a plant-based diet. All these things are significant changes that we can make to reduce our carbon footprint. By comparison, recycling, which is something that a lot of the time people do already do, that makes much less of a difference. That's 0.01 tons of CO2 per person. So these are the big changes that we can make if we want to reduce our emissions. But those are things that we can do to directly reduce our emissions as consumers, but we're not only consumers. People are also citizens, investors, role models, members of organizations. And through those different roles, there are lots of other actions that we can take. So we can vote and protest for ambitious climate policies as the citizens that we are. We can invest in green savings accounts. Through the relationships that we have with our family, members of communities, interest groups, neighbours, we can influence the people around us through conversations and through just taking action to set a good example. And in the workplace, through the organisations that we're part of, as employees and employers, there are choices that we can make to bring about wider change as well. So it's important to bear in mind all of these different roles that we have, that we can make a difference. What works to change behaviour? Well, we like to categorise interventions into downstream measures versus upstream measures. Downstream is where you're trying to influence people's choices directly. So this is through information provision, broadly speaking, things like labelling or advertisements or education. This is where you're trying to motivate and educate people to think and act differently. That contrasts with upstream measures, which is where you're trying to influence the context in which people are acting. So economic measures, prices and incentives, as well as changes to the availability of products and services through regulation, for example, but also changing the physical and the built environment as well to enable people to make changes are also really important things that work to change people's behaviour. And what we know is that information by itself, those downstream measures targeting individuals, tend not to be very effective. So one study found that on average, they're only 2 to 3% effective in changing people's environmentally friendly choices. Whereas upstream measures, depending on exactly which measure that you look at, regulation, for example, where maybe you're banning a high carbon choice, could be up to 100% effective. So the more upstream we focus our interventions, the more effective they tend to be. In our centre, which is the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, these are the sorts of changes that we're interested in. We started our centre 6.5 years ago. We're now comprise around 90 researchers and affiliates spread across 4 universities and a charity within the UK. And we have expertise across the social sciences of climate change, behaviour change, political science, organisational change, and so on. And we're really focused on the role that people play in mitigating or reducing climate change. And we're asking this question: how can we live differently and better in ways that achieve systemic, deep and rapid emission reductions. And we look across areas like food choices, how we heat and cool our homes, how we travel, and what we buy and consume. And we have 4 themes within our centre: a visioning theme where we're creating inspiring visions of the future, a learning theme where we look at how transformation has worked in the past, what works, a trialing theme where we're actually testing out interventions to try to change behaviour, change organisations, and we work with a range of organisations to do that. And our engaging theme is where we're embedding change in the real world. We're actually trying to get our insights used by policymakers and practitioners. I don't have time to talk about all the things that we do, but this just gives you a few examples of the sorts of projects that our centre is working on. So we've developed interventions to help households to reduce their water and energy use. We've been working with communities to promote community-supported agriculture and look at the various benefits of those different ways of feeding people. We're working with sports fans to encourage them to take climate action. We have been tracking public support for climate policies over time, working with big businesses to change how employees engage in climate action and embed that into institutional practices, and working with communities to encourage climate action, for example, through more sustainable ways of travelling. At the end of the first 5 years of our centre's work, we put together a report that tried to distill our key messages into five key messages. And you see them here. So the first one is really, by putting people at the heart of climate action, we can really accelerate progress to tackle climate change. We will be able to do more if we actually involve people and give people the support that they need to bring about change. We've also shown that there is broad public support for more ambitious climate action to reduce emissions, that we need to embrace diverse perspectives and to break down the systemic barriers to action, and that we need action across all levels of society and all sectors to really bring about change. And finally, that clear leadership is really important to send strong signals about the direction of society and to inspire people to make change. So that's just hopefully a summary of the sorts of things that we do in our centre.
Y vamos a ir con las preguntas, porque hay muchas y sobre todo empiezo por la primera. Convencer a la gente del Reino Unido o en total en toda la población del planeta, convencerla de que tiene que cambiar sus hábitos de vida puede ser complicado, porque hay gente que puede pensar que estas medidas que se proponen les complica la vida con las comodidades que ha conocido hasta ahora. ¿Cómo se rebate ese argumento?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's true that people don't like to make significant changes to their lifestyle if they think there will be a significant cost or there will be some major inconvenience. So people generally are resistant to change. However, what we know from the work of the IPCC, for example, is that actually most of the measures that we need to tackle climate change will actually improve people's quality of life. So it will help to reduce energy bills, it will make our air cleaner, it will improve our health through better diets, it potentially can reduce inequality, boost the economy. So the more that we can talk about these wider benefits of climate action, the more we're likely to build support amongst the public for making these changes. And it's absolutely critical that government also enables people to change their behaviour. In other words, they reduce the barriers to behaviour change by making it much cheaper and easier for people to play a role.
Por ejemplo, los jóvenes que están acostumbrados a viajar, están acostumbrados a consumir comprando online a través de plataformas como Amazon, AliExpress u otras, que provocan también un impacto ambiental muy, muy grande, porque Eso requiere un movimiento de mercancías desde muchas veces del continente asiático hasta el continente europeo o americano. El mensaje que se emite a los jóvenes es que de vida que hasta ahora han considerado como la mejor.
I think it's clear that we do have to communicate honestly with the public about the scale of change needed, because at the moment, people in developed countries in the global north have a carbon footprint many times the size of what we need if we are to have a safe climate. So we are going to have to reduce our emissions, and that involves lifestyle change. But it's crucial that we don't just locate responsibility for that change with individuals. We need to highlight actually the very significant role that government plays in making those changes possible for people. So, for example, you've highlighted travel. It's critical that governments are making sustainable travel, for example, train and public transport, walking and cycling, cheaper and more available for people, and making flying more expensive and less accessible and attractive for people. So we need to use sticks and carrots to incentivize people to make the right choice and disincentivize them away from polluting choices. Similarly, with online shopping at the moment, this is the most convenient option for many people. So we need to make it much more convenient for people to shop locally and to choose products that have lower carbon footprints, and to implement potentially economic measures so that the carbon costs of products are incorporated into the things that they're buying.
Y le quería preguntar sobre esta cierta involución que se está detectando, especialmente en el continente europeo, a raíz de este mensaje en relación a la crisis climática. Hay una involución en el sentido que está influenciada por la extrema derecha y los mensajes negacionistas de la crisis climática, del cambio climático, que parece que están calando o que están influenciando en muchos gobiernos para frenar en estas transformaciones hacia un planeta mejor, ¿no? Hacia un hábito de vida que ayude a que ese cambio climático se frene, ¿no? Claro, todo eso crea un nuevo escenario que me imagino que hace más complicada todavía esa tarea de convencer a la población, porque hay un sector cada vez mayor emergiendo en el negacionismo.
Well, it's true that there has been some backlash to climate policies in Europe and in other countries. And we have seen that particularly stoked by far-right political parties, that they are trying to create division and polarization within the public to increase opposition to climate policies. However, what the polling evidence suggests is that still there are very large majorities across the vast majority of countries that want more ambitious government action on climate change and are willing to play a role themselves in bringing about change. So I think the more it becomes clear that we all do have to change our lifestyles and that we cannot continue to have the size of carbon footprint that we currently do, there will be resistance amongst particularly those with vested interests in the status quo, so economic actors that potentially benefit from high carbon emissions and overconsumption. And so they will be resistant to the sorts of measures needed. But actually, the vast majority of the public are supportive of more climate action. And so at the moment, we don't see the effects of this backlash creating a majority that are opposed to climate action. On the contrary, most people still want more action to be taken.
Antes veíamos en uno de los gráficos que ha mostrado en su presentación que Estados Unidos lidera la huella de carbono. Y justamente Estados Unidos está liderado por un presidente, Donald Trump, que abandera el negacionismo. Eso en el país mayor de emisiones de CO2. ¿Cómo se revierte? Porque claro, la contaminación, para que la gente nos entienda, no tiene fronteras, no entiende de términos de países, sino que se traslada por todo el planeta y puede ser el emisor Estados Unidos y luego quedar perjudicados otras zonas del planeta por esa acción. ¿Cómo ve esta situación?
Yes, absolutely. While it's unfortunate that the US has pulled out of international agreements on climate action at the moment, we still see the majority of governments engaging constructively in the UN climate negotiations that are ongoing. And the vast majority do want to see change and to help address this existential threat that we're all facing on the planet to tackle climate change. And so internationally, there is more action to tackle climate change than there is inaction. But actually, where I see the most cause for optimism is at the local level, because despite the slow progress that UN negotiations on climate change have taken, actually municipalities and communities are getting on with implementing the changes needed to tackle climate change. And the reason that they're particularly motivated to do that is because many of the benefits of taking climate action can be visibly seen and experienced at the local level. So, for example, reducing air pollution is good for health, reducing road accidents, good for child safety, and so on. And these are things that these are win-wins for tackling climate change and improving our quality of life that can be realized at the local level. So that's where I see a lot more cause for optimism, is more locally than internationally.
Y luego también le quería preguntar sobre las cuestiones culturales. Me imagino que depende cómo sea la sociedad y sus hábitos de consumo, es más fácil convencerles de estas bondades de mejorar el clima. Lo digo porque antes hablábamos de sociedades muy consumistas, muy atadas pues, a viajar, a comprar online, etcétera, y otras en el mundo que tienen otra escala de valores y tienen otra manera de afrontar la vida, ¿no?
Absolutely, yeah. There are different cultural values that influence how we live our lives. You saw the graph of the average carbon footprint from the Hot or Cool Institute report, and even low-income countries have a carbon footprint on average that needs to be reduced if we're to stay within 1.5 degrees of global warming. So many global south countries are increasing their carbon footprint and have aspirations to consume more. And so the challenge is, how do we change aspirations globally to have lower carbon footprints and lower emissions and less materialism? And certainly there are cultures that are less materialistic than others, but still the challenge is to ensure that for global south countries, that they are developing in a way that doesn't replicate the polluting path of development that global north countries have followed so far, so that they can develop, but in a way that is greener and more in tune with safe global warming. So there's still a challenge, even though we have these very diverse cultural values actually in terms of emission trajectories.
Usted ha hablado mucho en sus artículos y también en sus charlas sobre la ansiedad climática, un estado de ánimo que se ha instalado en alguna parte de la población a raíz de los mensajes a veces quizás muy catastrofistas sobre el mundo al que vamos si no hacemos nada para evitarlo. ¿Nos hemos equivocado en algo en relación a cómo emitimos los mensajes vinculados a la crisis climática para que haya provocado esa ansiedad?
I think the media has tended to communicate climate change in ways that emphasize the catastrophic negative impacts of climate change, and those impacts are real. But what we know from the evidence is that communication that focuses on causing fear can backlash and discourage people from taking action unless they're accompanied by messages that promote action and are very clear on what steps people can take to reduce the risks that are being communicated to them. So yes, we do need to tell people about the serious risks of climate change, but we need to accompany that message with solutions to climate change and inspire people to take action and let them know that progress is starting to be made on climate change, that emissions are coming down, that they are part of a global collective that wants action on climate change. So communicating that actually the majority of people globally are worried about climate change and are starting to take action. So it's important, I think, to accompany any fear-based message with a message of hope and that contains solutions.
Sí, usted se refiere a los medios de comunicación como el nuestro y efectivamente parte de esa responsabilidad tenemos, pero yo también me quería referir a los movimientos sociales o de entidades que hacen declaraciones o que realizan actividades que a veces son percibidas pues con una cierta agresividad o enfado. Me refiero, por ejemplo, a Greta Thunberg, con ese aspecto, ese rictus siempre enfadada, que transmite pues una cierta, es inquietante, vamos, y que no hay mensajes positivos, siempre hay pues enfado y combatividad, ¿no? No sé si por ahí también los movimientos sociales deberían hacer una reflexión sobre cómo aproximarse al conjunto de la población, no solo a los más militantes, para que se conciencie, para que se convenzan en esa línea que usted nos explicaba antes.
Absolutely. And actually, there are some really positive examples of the media spotlighting everyday people taking climate action and highlighting the benefits of those choices. So in the UK, we have an organization called the Local Storytelling Exchange, which is where they're working with local journalists to emphasize stories of normal people, so not activists, but just everyday people buying a heat pump or like choosing more plant-based foods and emphasizing the way that this has improved their life, that it is possible, starting to make it normal. This is something that the media can do so that the messages about climate action are not only coming from activists. I think they're an important source to highlight some of the unfairness, some of the significant risks of climate change, but also to communicate that you don't have to be perfect, that all of the steps that you make are positive and make a difference, and that these are things that everyday people can do in their lives.
Hay otro término que se habla en el tema de la crisis climática, es vinculada también a la psicología de la sociedad, ¿no? Que es la transición justa. Es decir, que todo este movimiento a favor o para frenar el cambio climático no deje a nadie atrás. Tuvimos y vimos todas las protestas que hubo en Francia cuando se anunciaron los aumentos importantes en el tema del combustible por parte del sector primario, ¿no? De los agricultores, los pescadores y otros que salieron a la calle y bueno, hubo bastantes disturbios y protestas justamente contra eso. ¿Cómo se convence a estos sectores que ven que el cambio climático, que la lucha contra el cambio climático les puede perjudicar no solo a sus vidas, sino a su economía, a nivel individual, pero también a nivel de empresa?
Absolutely. I think the way in which we can avoid some of the backlash that you already mentioned and some of these protests, these very high profile protests, is to work with the unions and the workers in those sectors to ensure that there is a just transition, that people working in high emission sectors can retrain, can be given free training to get jobs that are less polluting in green sectors. And there are some nice examples of where industry and government have worked together to retrain staff and to transition them over to different types of work so that people are not left jobless and that communities are not devastated because of the loss of industries, as has happened in the past, but actually that we can do this in a way that is fair, that brings people with us and doesn't leave groups behind. So I think it's critical to do that if we want to have a fair and acceptable transition.
Antes hablábamos de los jóvenes, pero ahora ya no, los no tan jóvenes utilizan de forma habitual la inteligencia artificial, que es una tecnología que, por cierto, consume mucha o necesita mucha energía para poder funcionar. Aquí puede haber un mensaje contradictorio porque parece que el mundo va justamente hacia un uso mayor, masivo de esta tecnología. Y esta tecnología, como decíamos, tiene un impacto medioambiental. ¿Cómo se conjugan estas dos cosas?
Yeah, I think absolutely the rise of artificial intelligence is something that needs to be considered in a just transition and in a clean transition. I think we're still at the beginning of understanding the environmental impacts of AI, and while it can help to develop solutions to climate change, because the fantastic computing power that AI provides can help to model climate changes and develop solutions, technological solutions. So it is a potentially powerful tool to help with sustainability, but at the same time, yes, at the moment the energy used to for AI is very considerable. So unless that's coming from renewable power sources, it will, of course, contribute to increasing emissions as well. And I do think there is a behaviour change element to this, because actually at the moment, people might start to use AI when they don't necessarily need to for sort of everyday web searches, and just use AI and large language models to kind of to do that, when actually a simple web search could suffice. So there is a risk that we are using AI to do things that we don't necessarily need it for. So I think there's some interesting behavior change work to be done to actually look at where is AI useful, where is it maybe superfluous.
Usted hablaba antes de que los gobiernos tienen que implicarse más en ese empuje hacia cambios culturales. ¿En qué sentido? ¿Provocando o activando ayudas económicas, implicando a sectores económicos por la vía de bonificaciones para que aceleren esa evolución? ¿En qué sentido habría que los gobiernos tendrían que encaminarse para ese convencimiento general de la población?
Absolutely, yes. Well, at the moment, the government tends to use informational approaches to change behaviour, which, as I've argued, is not very effective. They do that not only in the environmental domain, but in the health domain, for example. They think that giving people information about what healthy lifestyle choices are will lead to behaviour change, and often it doesn't. That's because actually the society is constructed in ways that encourage us to eat in unhealthy ways, to not get enough exercise, and similarly to consume more than we need, to have high carbon footprints. And so there are structural forces that push us in a direction that is high carbon. And therefore, we need governments to use regulations, for example, to ban the most polluting products and services, to restrict advertising of those products and services, to enable people to recycle, reuse, repair their products. So there's a regulatory and approach that they can use there. There are plenty of economic measures that they can use. So, for example, we know that a frequent flyer levy or tax is something which is quite supported by the public. It's where you would pay more tax the more flying you do, but it doesn't penalise people from taking occasional flights. And so the polluter pays in that case. And so these are the sorts of measures which actually, while they are economic measures, are quite publicly acceptable. And as well as regulations, economic measures, the government also has an important role to change infrastructure and the design of towns and cities and buildings to enable people to take low carbon choices by default. And so we know, for example, that if you design a town to be more walkable and to have big cycle lanes and lots of opportunities for people to take public transport, and that public transport is affordable, then people will use those sustainable travel options and not drive so much. So governments can do lots of things encompassing both sticks and carrots to enable people to change their behaviour in a more sustainable direction.
Alguien que nos pueda estar escuchando, que espero que sean muchos, puede pensar, bueno, ahora que nos están diciendo que tenemos que volvernos veganos, a mí me gusta la carne o a mí me gusta el pescado, y ahora ¿por qué tengo que cambiar ese hábito de alimentación cuando a mí me gusta esa otra alimentación? ¿Qué respondería?
I think it's clear that plant-based diets or vegan diets are much less polluting to the environment. They're better in terms of climate change and biodiversity. But even just reducing the amount of red meat and dairy that we consume, those are the highest emitting food choices. And so reducing red meat and dairy would make a big difference in terms of reducing the emissions from diets. So it's not necessarily about completely giving up all meat and dairy. It's about reducing that, not only for the environmental benefits, but also the health benefits, because we know in most global north countries that actually we consume too much meat and dairy, that we have high protein diets and we're getting too much of our protein from animal sources. And so there are health benefits to reducing meat and dairy. And so there are two arguments for doing that. So it doesn't mean we all have to be vegan, but we do need to eat a bit less red meat.
Estos cambios culturales, estos cambios de hábito, requerirán un tiempo. ¿Ustedes han analizado cuánto tiempo, si las cosas fueran bien, tardaría la sociedad en general a adquirir esas nuevas maneras de comportarse? Porque claro, de un día para el otro, de hoy para mañana, parece que claro que no puede ser. Pero ¿han calculado más o menos en cuánto tiempo, años, generación se puede producir?
That's a great question, and we don't have a concrete answer about how long these changes take. Some of them can be done relatively quickly. So some of the quick wins would include just changing the choice architecture, so nudging people to make it easier for people to make greener choices. So, for example, within the public sector, we could have a greater availability of plant-based foods, just make it easier for people to choose those things. So that would see effects very quickly if that was implemented. That's something which government, local authorities could do quickly and see quick effects. We also see, for example, that things like electric vehicles are rolling out much quicker than was expected. So we now see that on average, 1 in 5 new vehicles is an electric car. That's really just the last years that to take off and start to replace petrol and diesel cars. So some of these things can take just a few years. Some will take longer, I think, to actually change people's values, and the cultural norms around consumption is something that could take maybe a generation or more. But if we start to make these changes that are quicker, they will all add up to make a bigger effect over the next few decades.
Y en ese sentido, me imagino que la educación desde bien pequeños tiene un papel fundamental. ¿Usted percibe que las nuevas generaciones, los niños y niñas, ya están creciendo con esta mentalidad?
I think this varies in different countries, but in general, I think because children are generally or often growing up in urban settings, they have less contact with nature, and so that lack of a nature connection means that then they don't necessarily value nature and think about the environment when they're making choices in their lifestyles. So that's the context in which young people are growing up, which makes it more difficult to make environmental choices. And while some countries are implementing curricula that talk about environmental challenges and climate change, often they don't talk about the range of climate solutions. So they might emphasize more the technological solutions than the social and behavioral changes that are needed. So when we've looked at the UK school curriculum, that's what we found, is that a lot of the climate solutions talked about to young people are engineering solutions. And because of that, then when young people think about having maybe a green career, they often think about maybe an engineering type of job, and they don't necessarily think about other sectors that might enable them to have low carbon career trajectories that would involve behavior change or social change or other sorts of skills. So I think there is a missed opportunity there to really embed climate change within our curriculum in a much more fundamental way, and to get people to think about the range of career options that could be open to them.
Imagínese un niño o una niña que va de la mano de su papá o de su mamá a un supermercado. Ese niño, esa niña que ha ido al colegio y que le han dicho que sobre todo hay que evitar los plásticos y hay que evitar los envoltorios, y se va a ese supermercado y encuentra que compra una manzana y está envuelta en plástico, compra 1 kilo de plátanos y está envuelto en plástico, y se va con el carro de la compra con mucho más plástico a casa del que es necesario. Aquí hay una incoherencia absoluta. ¿Cómo se resuelve esto? Porque mucha gente, muchos usuarios, consumidores que nos estarán viendo, se habrán encontrado en esta situación. Aquí hay como un mensaje muy contradictorio, ¿verdad?
Absolutely, yes, which is why education by itself is not enough. It does help to lay the foundations for people's understanding about the solution, but unless the context in which people act changes, they're not going to be able to actually change their behavior in ways that they might want to. So they might be inspired to do more, but actually they find it too inconvenient or too expensive, or simply the solutions are not available to them. So the structures and the system and the context around us absolutely needs to change to enable people to make those choices. And there is also a feedback there, because people will then learn about what's a different way of doing things. They will start to see those options as more normal. The more we can have the sustainable option be the default option, so that we don't need to make the effort always to choose green, that actually it's the natural choice, the more people will kind of start to change their patterns of behavior in fundamental ways. So yes, at the moment, this is why we see that actually advertising the need to change behavior, putting labels on products, that's not enough, because people might say great, but it's still too expensive, or it's not something that where I live.
O, por ejemplo, quedamos impactados constantemente en las redes sociales de consumir, comprar un producto que se hace en Asia y que lo tendrás en casa al cabo de un par de días. Estamos finalizando esta conversación, pero me gustaría, estos días se está celebrando la conferencia del clima en Brasil y parece que hay como un cierto pesimismo sobre lo que pueda salir de ahí. ¿Usted qué piensa? ¿Que puede haber alguna resolución importante o con que nos mantengamos como estamos ya nos podemos dar por satisfechos?
Well, I'm hopeful that the COP30 in Brazil will make some progress on climate change. Usually there is some incremental progress that's made through these international negotiations, even though it can be frustratingly slow. It does take a long time, but we are moving in the right direction through those talks. But actually, I think we shouldn't be too disheartened if we don't get everything we want out of those talks, because it's difficult to bring that many countries with those many different needs and views and diverse vested interests along in the same direction. Whereas at the local level, change can happen quicker, and so we can start to see the effects much more. So this is why I think actually looking at the local to find hope and just take part in local action, we can all do more to be part of the community initiatives, as part of our work, as part of just being neighbours, parts of communities, even having a conversation about climate change. These are all things that we can do to be part of a solution, and we don't have to wait for governments to do to make choices through these international talks.
Bueno, pues lo dejamos aquí. Muchas gracias a Lorraine Whitmarsh por mantener esta conversación con nosotros y participar en estas conferencias que le llamamos sostenibilidad. Y hoy hemos hablado sobre la psicología, sobre el cambio de hábitos y cómo podemos influir en nuestra sociedad para que la lucha contra el cambio climático sea efectiva. Muchas gracias y hasta pronto.
Thank you very much. See you soon.